ever. I'd like to face both of you. It feels like a daytime chat show.
Yeah, nice.
So tell me how you redecorated your kitchen. Hi, everyone. My name is Ash Sarkar, and it is an immense privilege to be moderating this panel, listening to the voice of AI with Matt Dryhurst and Holly Herndon. And before we get started, I would quite like to abuse my position as panel moderator, so please bear with me. It's often said that the cause of labor is the hope of the world. And over these next few days, you'll be hearing from a lot of people about their work. And you'll be hearing a lot of panels, such as this one, about the nature of work itself and how AI and automation has transformed employment conditions for everyone. So the irony of the riggers who set up a lot of this festival, protesting on the streets outside over pay and conditions, does not escape me. And as a worker who was lucky enough to be invited to this incredible festival, I'd like to take this moment to stand in complete solidarity with the striking riggers. Your struggle is my struggle, it is our struggle, and I call on Sónar to meet their demands and to end the use of legal action as a means of either suppressing or indeed undermining the integrity of a strike. Sónar is not just its artists, it's not just its speakers, it's the cleaners, it's the security guards, it's the caterers, it's the administrative staff, it's the technical support. And it's these workers who, united, I hope, will never be defeated. They are the front line of the struggle for better pay and conditions, which ultimately just adds up to a recognition for the dignity of humanity. So like I said, the cause of labor is the hope of the world, solidarity with the striking riggers. So that was cringy. So when I told a friend of mine last night that I was chairing this panel with the both of you, he reacted like I just said I was going to do backing dancing for Rihanna. He was so excited. Cool. So yeah, can you just do Umbrella quickly one time? Just to introduce them both very quickly, Holly Herndon is a composer, a performer, a digital researcher, in particular focusing on the role of the voice within technology. Matt Dryhurst is a researcher, a musician, a professor at NYU.
Yep.
Very fucking fancy.
Yeah. Adjunct.
Oh my God. He specializes on the relationship between cultural creation and internet infrastructure. And together, Matt and Holly have had a baby. Or kind of a baby. So would you please, just to kick things off, talk a bit about Spawn?
Sure. So Spawn is kind of a metaphor for a series of experiments that we've been doing using neural networks. So this is a project that I've been working on with Matt and with Jules Laplace, who's also here, who was doing a Spawn workshop this morning here at Sónar. And so about 3 years ago, we started working together, just experimenting with different architectures, and basically had a good 6 months to a year's worth of crappy results, but we stuck with it, and it kind of culminated in collaborating with our vocal ensemble in Berlin. So we work with a really talented, amazing group of people in Berlin who have helped us train Spawn on their voices, and so that then culminated in the creation of PROTO, which is our most recent album.
Yeah.
And we're also presenting that tomorrow.
Ooh.
Yeah, and I guess the only other thing to add to that is, part of the reason we work with it, obviously it's been coming for some time. People talking about AI, machine learning, the automation question. One of the primary reasons we wanted to work with it was basically to be able to figure out kind of more clearly what is possible and what isn't possible. So what is a real concern and what isn't an actual concern. Right, and so that was kind of the intention behind doing the project in the first place, was being what's interesting here, what's actually worth playing around with, and what can we instantly dismiss from this conversation through actually playing around with it. Yeah.
And oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, so like, what were the things that you sort of discovered or learned more, and what were the threads that you followed through that process?
Well, from the very beginning, we kind of made this ideological decision to not use MIDI data and to instead use sound as material. And there are several reasons for that, but one of them is we didn't want to train on past canon. So often when you use MIDI data as a training set, you're kind of turning a piece of music into pitch and rhythm, kind of reducing it to those two parameters. We have a technical issue.
Oh, you're such a diva, Matt.
And so you're often kind of relying on a past canon of work. And we really wanted to create our own training sets from scratch to also acknowledge the people and the work that goes into the creation of the training sets, and also to have more kind of like creative control over the training sets themselves. So that was just even like learning what it meant to make a training set, and how like, yeah, how political those like very early decisions can be from the get-go. And for you?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much the same. And actually, to speak to your opening points, talking about the rigors and about all the kind of work that goes into constructing the artifice that we experience, the same analogy can kind of be made for the AI conversation, right? Is like a machine or a neural network learns based on a huge amount of data gathered that has been created by somebody. And so the results that you see at the end of the Google Translate result, for example, or the voice model, someone has done that work. And so invariably also with the results we were getting, the more people we brought into the process, the kind of higher fidelity the model was, and the better our results became. And so in terms of the parenting argument, maybe presupposing some of the conversation a bit later, that also makes that kind of a bit more complicated, obviously, because Holly and I started working on this together, then we start working with Jules, who actually activates the possibility of it, because Jules is far more technically competent than either Holly or I, and then we start working with 10 to 15 more people to start training the models, and so you end up with a very, very abstract version of kind of parenting under that metaphor, which of course, that metaphor extends to a greater societal conversation about who's creating these data sets and ultimately who's benefiting from them, and how wide is our field of vision to be able to accredit and compensate potentially all the people whose work went into creating that end product. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's that phrase, it takes a village to raise a child, so did it take a village to raise Spawn?
It did. I mean, that's the approach that we took. Yeah, I mean, so we're using this metaphor of a child, and of course it's problematic in its own ways. I think people confused the metaphor as a human baby, but we're trying to be really deliberate about saying this is an inhuman intelligence, this is an inhuman child, and yeah, it's this kind of it takes a village metaphor to raise. And also Spawn doesn't have context outside of what specifically we're feeding her, in the same way that a child only has access to the kind of community that's around her and kind of raises in that way.
I mean, I was really interested in the emphasis you placed on listening when it came to Spawn, and sort of Spawn's interaction with the world as one of listening. And I was reminded of one of my favorite Meryl Streep interviews ever, where she's somewhere in Northern Ireland and she's being asked by someone with a very, very strong Belfast accent, how do you inhabit character? How do you become the character in the way which only Meryl Streep can? And then in a perfect Belfast accent, she responded with, "I listen."
Oh, wow.
And so what are the implications for not just the voice as an instrument in music, but the voice as a tool in other forms of cultural production, including comedy or acting or radio drama, which Spawn is raising?
Well, I've been obsessed with the voice for over a decade, and I think I'm also really interested in technology, and for me it was always the kind of perfect vessel to pair the voice with. At the early days, it was with laptop music as a way to kind of create an embodied performance mechanism, or to create almost like a bridge that people could immediately understand and relate to. Most people have access to a voice. Most people know what it feels like to vocalize. Whereas when you're dealing with maybe more esoteric instruments, there's then a level of abstraction in order to fire those mirror neurons and to kind of relate to what's going on stage. So that's how the obsession really started, as this kind of marriage of technology and the voice, and using it as a vessel to kind of like meet the audience. I mean, in my earliest days, I started out as a noise musician, and so back then the goal was like, how can I create a wall and like be as difficult to understand as possible, and like I'm so esoteric you'll never get it. And then I slowly started to realize actually I want to connect with my audience. That's actually a good thing, and so the voice was the most immediate tool for that.
Yeah, and I think to speak to accents and actors, a lot of the early experiments we were doing were very much based on mimicry. And so there's a term within the machine learning community that a lot of people will be familiar with this more with imagery, the idea of style transfer, right? So being able to study the kind of distinguishing characteristics of something that make it, that make it the thinginess of the thing. Okay.
You're
Sorry.
saying,
Yeah, my mic. I could hear myself feeding back. It's all good. All right. Yeah. So with style transfer, you're basically like analyzing an image to try and figure out what the distinguishing characteristics are, so that you can then transpose those characteristics over to a different image, let's say. Now, with voice, that starts to get really interesting, because what you're describing, for example, of speaking in a different accent, that mimicry all of a sudden becomes quite easy to do, or easy to conceive of being done very well in the very short term. And so a number of questions come up with that, right? Like one, which you've done far more work on than I have in your PhD work, but specifically like who owns a voice, right? When we've developed the technology for me to be able to kind of simulate, say, your distinct English accent, what does it mean that I can then go and take that and use it for my own purposes? How much ownership do you have of that? And also, what
It's actually very easy. It's like 1 part Maurice Stewart to 2 parts Don is wavy. Very easy.
Is the meta tags. Yeah, so there's that whole component of like who owns what, and then the second part, of course, is like, are people ready for that? And so we've seen that with kind of the weekly scare story about deep fakes. But underlying that, there is something new there, right? We have kind of crossed this threshold where it goes from away from kind of like an impersonation realm into like a fairly accurate replication realm.
I mean, it sort of strikes me that there is a relationship between the voice and the loss of the voice. And so on the one hand, it's the immediacy of speech. Once it's out of your mouth, it's gone. There's the sort of precarity of, the material that you record the voice with. And then I always think about singers like Mariah Carey, who had to develop whistle tone because she was going to lose her voice if she didn't, because of vocal polyps. There's also these very haunting recordings of, I think, the last castrato to exist in Western Europe. And so thinking about the way in which I think the voice obsesses us, because it is this sort of ghostly and ephemeral means of communication for AI to listen and to have a voice. And one of the purposes of AI is that it has better storage of memory than any of us. What happens when you take away some of that risk of loss?
Well, I've always been obsessed with the digitally processed voice because I feel like it was a way to augment my own natural body, right? So I was like, okay, I was born with this kind of like mediocre, okay-ish voice. How can I augment it to make it, more interesting? And some people call auto-tune or things like that bringing the voice up to code. So almost like taking the voice and putting it in the kind of like machine legible universe. But for me, the kind of romantic notion of being able to copy myself and be able to create a tool that could then transcend what my physical form could ever do is like a very romantic and seductive kind of notion. Like Spawn doesn't have to breathe, she can sing really fast. She has like an incredible range, But the idea of what's lost, I mean, I think it really... That's the most interesting thing about working with the voice model is it totally opens up this Pandora's box of what does it mean. You touched on this a little bit. What does it mean to own your voice, or what's the kind of like your own autonomy with the voice? So we were looking at Nancy Sinatra. So she had These Boots Are Made for Walking, her famous track. So Goodyear Tire used that song with a voice alike to create a commercial. And she sued them, but she lost. And then 20 or 10 years later, Bette Midler had a similar situation where her song, If You Want to Dance, what they used a voice alike, and Mercury, a car company, they made a commercial with that song, and she won using Nancy Sinatra's case as kind of precedent. And her case stated that they were emulating her voice likeness too much, which is really interesting precedent, because also the history of vocal style from bel canto to folk to pop is an emulation, is a mimicry. I mean, we learn how to speak by mimicking one another. So there's this really kind of hairy gray area there about what it means to actually own something. But we have case law around sampling, like actually recording someone's specific voice, but we don't have legal precedent for extracting the vibe of or the essence of someone's voice and then emulating it. And so that's what neural networks, that really opens up this box and makes it possible to be, fully automated.
Well, that's the thing. And so, yeah, to speak specifically on loss, right? Like the last castrati, their voice was lost with the death of their physical body. And some trace of them remains through a recording that hopefully will not be lost, and then it's archived. The question is now raised of should some things be lost forever, i.e., should we not be mining the outtakes from a Prince record in order to construct a new Prince record and make more money off the back of his legacy without his permission?
But as soon as it's machine legible, it can become part of a training set and part of a canon. And that's a kind of terrifying truth.
And so that's the bigger kind of ethical and also I think legal question that this kind of brings up is, we talked a lot, post Snowden there was this kind of conversation, okay, so now hypothetically everything you do online is potentially a performance. We now know that potentially somebody might be witnessing this that was not intended. Now, the age of machine learning, neural networks, kind of crawling bots on the web, the idea is anything that we do that could hypothetically be documented, as in this talk or me going to the bathroom, contributing to a data set that might be utilized as part of a model to create something, right? And what does that mean? And in the case of Prince, it's easier to parse because you're like, well, you're probably going to use Prince's outtakes to make another record. But that bigger question, I don't think most people have considered that, and we don't really have the tools to pull that apart right now.
See, it's interesting that when you were talking about the collection of those data sets, you were saying, okay, so what does it mean for a creative process? With me, with my vulgar Marxist brain, I was like, okay, so what does that mean for coercive models, control models? One of the main ways in which artificial intelligence has been used has been workplace monitoring. Someone was talking to me this morning about there being sort of AI that can measure how long, not only how long do you spend in the bathroom while you're at work, but how much you produce while in the bathroom. So they could work out if you were just sitting on the toilet to play on your phone. 33% of job applications now are processed by some form of artificial intelligence. There are moves to help to use artificial intelligence within interview setups as well. So you've got, maybe 250,000 criteria that you don't even know are being applied to you while you're in a job interview setting. So I guess one of my questions for you is, how do you navigate using a form of technology which is so closely twinned with coercion and control to produce an album like PROTO?
I think it makes it all the more important to actually get your hands dirty and understand what's going on with it. Because before we started working with neural networks, I didn't really understand how much or how dramatically the small tweaks to the data sets themselves would affect the outcome. People think, of course, data's not neutral, but when you really see it firsthand, how manipulable, if that's a word, the outcome can be. So I think it makes it all the more important to get involved with it and to fully understand with it, so that you can have a really informed ethical stance.
Yeah, and the other side too is there are kind of multiple different conversations going on, right? Part of it is just dealing with it to be able to understand what it does out of some kind of romantic modernist attempt to be cool, there's opportunity here, right? The other side is there is a more serious conversation that is a bit more niche that some people here might care about, which is this is most likely going to happen anyway. How do we intercept and present, maybe kind of problematize this in a way that pushes things in one direction rather than the other? And I think Holly, for example, mentioning training on vast MIDI sets, there is an analogy there to be made with kind of implicit bias in police data or anything, right? Are we basically
training these machines to repeat past mistakes or past folly of judgment in canonizing Bach as being the ultimate example of music that we must, if you look at, for example, many projects by kind of commercial companies, they will hold Bach up to be like, the second that this machine can reproduce Bach, we know it is good at music. And I think that's a problem, that's a question that's worth problematizing, because of course, MIDI information and tablature and written music doesn't contain a whole bunch of stuff, right? It doesn't contain like timbre or context, or there's loads of things that are very musical, that contribute to a musical experience, that shouldn't be omitted from that process, right? So in us emphasizing recorded sound, in us emphasizing us creating our own data sets, so Spawn has been trained pretty much on every stuff that we put a microphone to. It's hopefully trying to push people in a different direction that talks specifically about attribution, about transparency of sources. Yeah.
Also, I think we're in a unique position because we're not working for like a corporate research institution, so we don't have this kind of like objective where we have to hit these certain metrics. We can literally just play, and like that might sound romantic, but allow the neural network to reveal certain aesthetic opportunities that I might never have thought of myself. So really approaching it in a kind of experimental way that I think is kind of a unique position as an artist.
I mean, there's an aspect of this parenting metaphor that I want to like get into and poke with a big old stick, because there is a very strong history, particularly in the global north, particularly thinking about the role of whiteness, the role of capital, this history of trying to externalize the process of childbirth, pregnancy, child rearing, wet nursing. This is a very, very long and rich tradition. So how does this parenting metaphor play in with this history of, the externalizing of pregnancy in order to sort of sanitize, one's own body? You're not being polluted or, rendered ugly or whatever through the process of having to deal with a baby that just cries and shits all the time. How does that fit in with this project, or does it?
For me, it's actually really separate because, again, I'm trying to see Spawn as an inhuman baby. So an inhuman baby has very different physical properties from a human baby. So I'm not trying to remove myself from the messiness of human childbirth because it's an entirely different relationship. I mean, we're really inspired by Donna Haraway's ideas of kinship and, having relationships with animals or other inhuman kind of systems, and seeing basically the human intelligence as not this kind of apex and all be all of intelligence on planet Earth. So for me, it's not a kind of disjunction. I don't know for you.
Yeah, same. I mean, I think I can try and speak to that a little bit, though. I mean, I think the parenting metaphor was pretty much about saying, again, borrowing from Haraway and saying, we have this scenario in which we are raising something and acknowledging the role of multiple people within the community in raising this as somewhat analogous to the greater societal trouble of what do we do with this thing, right? It's still very nascent. Are we birthing a monster, or can this turn into something a bit more fertile and kind of an equitable, right? So
I think that's what my mum said when she found out she was pregnant. I guess it's going to be a monster.
Yeah, exactly. But also to speak, I mean, there's no real attempt to sanitize this, because I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, if anything, our approach has been to kind of make the conversation about machine learning and AI a bit more sticky, specifically talking about the construction of this kind of perfect artifice. So for example, it was very intentional that the first thing that the public ever heard from Spawn was a really messy, gross recording of Spawn kind of
gargling
doing something really
Jalen's
weird
music.
with Holly's voice, in contrast, in fact, with the overly sanitized kind of female voice assistant that most people are familiar with, of being like, no, this is actually what it sounds like when it develops a bit more agency. It is a bit wild and kind of a bit more feral. So if anything, I'd like to see the conversation around machine learning get a bit more amniotic in that way, because I think that's actually a far more interesting discussion.
Because I guess one of the things that I'm thinking about, and across some of these talks which are here today, is the role of AI and machine learning in the arts. And I can't help but think about what is the political context which produces this interest. On the one hand, it's the availability of the technology, a certain democratization of the technology, where the barrier that is cost of entry falls, and it means that, you know, artists, musicians, writers, creative producers can take it, run with it, and play with it. And then the other is what I think of as the great crisis of our time, which is what capitalism has done is created a class of dirty humanity, right? So sort of, you know, dirty in terms of, you know, it's unclean, it's not meant to be here, it's a foreign object, a thing out of place, like a disease, and like get rid and drown and expel and blah, 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 blah. And I think that is a sort of anxiety that I think comes with knowing that like we're on a planet which can no longer sustain our life on it. It's that humanity itself becomes this dirty thing. And that perhaps this is something which drives some of the interest in AI from the arts. It's a way of sort of, you know, dealing with or not dealing with that context.
I think that's a fair criticism. I mean, a lot of people, you know, have placed this criticism that AI is just this grand distraction away from climate disaster, that you can kind of think about AI, the future kind of AI scenario instead. I mean, this is something that we touched on a little bit with a project that we did, Deep Belief. So we did a project at Martin Gropius Bell that was a public training ceremony. So our ensemble led the public, about 300 people, through a call and response training, so data gathering ceremony. And they played different roles, each ensemble member. And one of the, each ensemble member represented kind of like one of the most popular worldviews on towards AI. So one of them was inherently this kind of like religious figure of like viewing AI as something that will save us from our sins, you know, save us from ourselves, essentially. So I think this is an apt criticism, and it's just, I think it's something that we have to be aware of as we navigate it.
But I think to speak to this idea of like the cleansing quality, right? Like I actually agree with you, and that's more reason to deal with it. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of a greater position. I mean, my personal position, I can't speak for anyone else here, but specifically, I am a lefty. I read the books, and I don't want to cede that territory to people whose approach and whose greatest imagination about machine learning is to create cleansed citadel somewhere away from the people, right? I don't offer it enough respect, right? The tools are available. Much of this technology was developed within public infrastructure, as with most tech stuff. So if there is an overwhelming narrative of AI as this kind of clean way to go about your day and just ignore homeless people, I think that that's a great failure, not of AI or of machine learning or of the potential of it, but of our imaginations to seize some of the narrative of that stuff and project something better, right? Because ultimately machine learning is about us, right? We contribute to it. We contribute to the models to make it work. And it's also about coordination. Right? And so you're talking about now you have private entities, private transnational entities who have the ability to gather a load of data about a bunch of people transnationally, and under their under their objectives, come up with some rather sophisticated coordination mechanisms to generate capital or value or whatever it might be. I see there being a lot of optimism potentially if more people on the left would start getting their hands dirty with this topic to say, well, no, you have this crazy coordination tool in which large groups of abstract people can coordinate to do quite interesting things. What does that mean? You know? And so that criticism, I think, is exactly valid, but is something that we're attempting to critique, not contribute to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Right, I was thinking of moving to an audience Q&A. We have how many minutes? We've got 20 minutes, good amount of time for a audience Q&A. So yeah, who's up for it? Show me some hands. Hands. They're on the end of your arm. You go like this. There we go. Hang on, I think someone is coming around with a microphone. So just keep your hand up. Grey t-shirt.
Thank you. Now, just a quick question. You are speaking about this pawn system. Can you give a bit more detail about it? What is it about? What it does? What is the basic principle behind it? Just to know a bit more about it. Thank you.
Totally. I mean, basically, so Spawn is like a catch-all system for a project, basically. And so we have a gaming PC, a Linux system running at home, of which we've run a bunch of different software libraries. So anything from a bunch of TensorFlow experiments, a bunch of like recurrent neural network experiments, a couple of custom converter things that Jules put together. So the kind of secret source of Spawn that most people know and that maybe is the most promising for the real-time system that we're developing, is actually kind of a cluster of different open source code that's been pulled together by Jules and given some kind of weight with a couple of little interesting techniques. So Spawn in and of itself is basically everybody has access to the code that's available online. It's all on GitHub.
And this is one of the reasons why you saw such a spike in artworks around 2016, 2017, is because this is when these white papers were published and made freely available online.
Yeah, exactly. So it's freely available code, just refined over a 2-year research process of trial and error, basically. Yeah.
Of hell for the first 6 months.
Any more questions? Oh, I've got a hand right in the middle, just there.
Hi. I was wondering if you could explain some of the trial and error, like what you're feeding it, like different melodies, and you said that you worked with a choir in Berlin.
Yeah, so sometimes it was on a kind of software tweaking side, so as Matt mentioned, kind of like certain weights. But in terms of the data sets themselves, we would learn, which input Spawn responded more to. So for example, when we were using recursive neural networks, we noticed that she really liked transients. So basically because it's like a microsound technique, so building sound sample by sample. So if you see a huge difference between one sample to the next, like you see in a transient, then that's something that she can really understand or really respond to. So then we would start creating data sets with more kind of spiked transients.
That's the thing, and I think because obviously when you work with stuff like this, like a bunch of people get excited about it, which I think there's very valid reasons to get excited about this technology. The most distinctive imprint of Spawn on the record is the color of the record, is the sonic color of the record, right? So we didn't spend a lot of time training Spawn on melodic information, which Holly would describe as MIDI or tablature or written music.
I think the best way to explain it is Spawn is a performer. So we are the composers. We're writing everything. Spawn. It's not any kind of like automated writing process. Like we're writing everything, and then we're asking Spawn to perform certain things in certain ways.
Which is actually...
He's a member of the vocal ensemble.
Which is actually, as far as we could tell, the most novel aspect of the technological leap in this space. Because there has been, MIDI reconfiguration experiments since the late 70s. The ability to crunch actual audio information and get vocal timbres out of that stuff is relatively new, at least to be able to do that at home. So that was like the main impetus behind the training models.
More hands, more questions?
Thank you very much. First of all, big fan of you guys. Love your art.
Thank you.
Well, you said that you guys consider Spawn more like a member, a performer. So I've seen, a lot of the new trends is to make precisely a new artist, per se. I don't know if you have seen like Ash Sarkar. He made Yona. So I was wondering, for you guys, when does it stop being your work and when does it start to be the art of the software?
I mean, I already consider it the work of the group that fed Spawn. So, I mean, Spawn's nothing else but the group of people who trained her. So it's all of the ensemble members, it's the public who went into the training sets. It's just a reflection of us as it is. So to see her as this kind of autonomous other is already problematized in my mind.
Yeah, I've seen a number of projects like that. The reason why we at least didn't pursue that approach is under the kind of the ideology that these tools ought to be there to have us be able to do more interesting things with each other. So the narrative isn't the familiar dystopian one of replacing humans. In fact, it's the exact opposite. We've made economically deleterious decisions to put more humans on stage in order to counterbalance the amount of stuff we talk about AI on this record, right? So more power to people doing that stuff. Like there are a number of interesting projects around automated artists. There's a friend of ours, Gene Kogan, working on a project called Abraham at the moment, and I'm furiously emailing with him being like, put attribution at the beginning. There's lots of really interesting stuff in that universe, but with us it was deliberately not the case.
And that was at the very beginning, like the very early embers, as like we were touring a lot and we were noticing started seeing that the human performer was being replaced by mechanical lights and visuals. And I mean, I love that stuff, and we'll see a lot of that at Sonar over the next couple of days, and I still enjoy that, but I was kind of asking myself, where is the human body in this kind of landscape? So I was like, I want to sing with people. I want more human performers. And so Spawn's in no way meant to replace someone. If anything, you know, the laptop is still the kind of like, in some way, kind of a brain that's allowing us as human performers on stage to experience human ecstasy together and to celebrate together.
Yeah,
Thank you, guys.
To leave with a kicker, I don't think we need to look at kind of inhuman representations of humans to understand that people don't care about the humans that make the music that they make. You just have to go to Spotify.
Before we move on to the next question, just quickly off the back of that, one of the things that you were talking about is the sort of like, you know, choral setup and the sort of ecstatic nature of human voices coming together, is that there is this sort of like, you know, gospel or almost Christian element to it. Because you also have at the center of it an immaculate conception. Right? This is how you know did English Lit at uni. I read the Bible. I saw another hand. Yeah.
Hello. I have somewhat two questions. One is you called it an inhuman baby before, but you're referring to Spawn as she.
Mm-hmm.
So what makes it female inhuman? And the second part would be, obviously music consists of a lot more than voice. And once you have basically this machine being able to replicate certain types of sounds, do you have plans to extend that to other types of music sources, whether it's drones or beats or anything?
I mean, right now we're still trying to perfect the live performance system, so we haven't really gotten past that, but I'm not crossing anything off the list. The reason why I decided to use the female pronoun, and this has been, I guess, pretty controversial for some people, especially given the history of female digital assistants being, you know, mistreated and that abuse then been being carried over into the real world, or into the physical world, I should say. The reason why I used she is because the first training sets were my voice, and so the first utterances that I heard were my specific voice, and so I used the female pronoun, and I heard myself reflected in Spawn. So it's really just that simple.
I'd also say too, because I've been partial to these conversations from removed, it is a long history of referring to machines as she. Like
Boats.
Cars, my baby. Right? I mean, and on top of that, there's also a long history of referring to female animals as she. That would also be an inhuman. Yeah. But I do think it's interesting. I mean, it was one of those things that, like, a lot of this stuff, as I say, it was preempted at the beginning before we started working on it. We're like, okay, this is a very loaded topic. Here is a bunch of work we could do to make sure that our politics sync with what might eventually come out of this. And then that quite like normal utterance has ended up being quite a problem for some people.
Well, you have this kind of like problematized history that we of course have to deal with and we have to acknowledge, but then we also, you know, we operate in this pretty amazing and very privileged kind of space of being able to create our own world and kind of create our own reality. And that involves a lot of fantasy. And so in my fantasy world of Proto, I can use she towards Spawn, and it's not mired in this kind of you know, hideous digital assistance shit that comes out of Silicon Valley. And I realize that there's a conversation between those two, but I also feel like I should be able to create that space.
I mean, there's also a sort of long cultural lineage, not just in terms of the naming of machines, but the naming of an inhuman creation, as she, in the gendering of it, is that's a story as old as, you know, the Pygmalion, and, you know, going further and further back. So I guess I can't answer for you, but for me, hearing you gender Spawn, it set off those little chimes for me.
Mm-hmm. Also, to speak, last question, I'll say the real-time system that we're working with right now, it's not necessarily, I mean, voice is almost the easiest thing to train it on. But one of the things we're quite excited about is the ability to bring in any instrument that produces a certain timbre and work towards some kind of a real-time style transfer. That starts getting really, really, really compelling, I think. And so voice is just the natural, obviously with Holly, it's kind of like the first port of call, but there's no reason why it should stop there, yeah.
More questions, more hands. I'd like to hear from some more women in the audience.
I mean, also Spawn's performing percussive lines through a voice model. So there is already kind of like it's not just specifically vocal lines. I don't know if that.
Ladies, hands. Right in the middle.
Following what you were talking right now, I found very interested how you sure are about the inhuman concept. So if you can explain a little bit more which influences in, you talk about Nora Haraway or so. So which, in terms of theory, how do you approach the inhuman part of it? Because you are human, so.
I mean, there's some really incredible philosophers writing on this right now. Reza Negarestani has a book out called The Spirit and the
Intelligence and Spirit.
Thank you, and that directly addresses the inhuman. I'm also this article that Kavya Bawa.
Anil.
Thank you, Anil. He writes really eloquently around ideas of the inhuman.
Yeah, and it's actually quite interesting because it's quite a lot to distill into like a small conversation, but there's a great essay called The Labor of the Inhuman on eFlux that's like a pretty good starting point on here. And what the inhuman in a sense does is kind of problematize the idea of humanity in general, of basically suggesting that humans, human is a term that's often used to discriminate against people. It has like a quite hideous history. The idea of the inhuman is one of constant becoming. The idea of it's the most human thing in a sense to improve in some ways, right? And we can debate at length about what that improvement might be, but that actually an inhumanist history is in a sense challenging this kind of very fixed definition of what is a human and what isn't a human.
And it's really building on Haraway in that way. I mean, she lays a lot of the foundation for this, but also seeing human intelligence as this kind of like collective human project that everybody's kind of fed into, and how that relates to then inhuman intelligence.
Do you love Spawn?
Oh, sometimes.
I wouldn't go so far as say I love it. But the one thing I will say, and I think, does anyone know anything about like EVP or electronic voice phenomenon? It's this phenomenon. There's an amazing record. Go out and get this record. I hope it might be on a streaming thing called The Ghost Orchid, which is a collection of basically white noise that different people have to listen to maybe in times of war. So you were like a signal interceptor and you were listening for a really long time to this frequency. And people over time started to hear voices, but they didn't start to hear voices, just any voice. They would start to hear voices of people that were familiar to them. So my dead relative or something like that. It's an actual phenomena. And I'll say that to some extent, the amount of time we have spent listening to barely listenable by most standards audio over the course of this project, you do develop something akin to a personal relationship with it, and I would challenge anyone to not, because it is a visceral thing that you do. I wouldn't go so far as to say it was love.
But you also hear the humans that you love that went into it. Like you hear their voices. I mean, that's one thing. This isn't necessarily Spawn related, but one of the reasons why I wanted to work with an ensemble is I was really lonely in the studio, and I wanted to spend more time with other people. And of course, I still had to spend tons of alone time in the studio just editing. But sometimes I would be like editing a recording session, and I would hear somebody tell a joke in between the sessions and like start laughing, and I would find myself like laughing in the studio because I felt like I was hanging out with my friends. I know that sounds really like pathetic, like just playing recordings with my friends.
your knee with a laptop in front
Holly
of
was
you.
not allowed to leave the studio for the duration of the making of this.
But I felt the love that we experienced in the during the making of that recording. I felt it again in the studio when I was editing, and it's kind of a similar thing with Spawn. Is you can hear the voices of these people that you really care about kind of reflected back at you.
More questions? We've got time for a couple more. Okay, all right, so striped t-shirt and then grayish t-shirt and headphones.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier that there was this thing with, was it Sinatra, Nancy Sinatra? Like being like in this issue with her music being used. Do you imagine Spawn being used by somebody else, by another group, having other composers?
I mean, I imagine systems similar to Spawn being used pretty heavily. I mean, it's really, I think, potentially very game-changing in music. I often like to use the metaphor of like if a sample could sprout legs and then run off in a new direction. So if you think about the entire archive of recorded sound could potentially become training data. And so I imagine we're going to see all kinds of wild experiments, some totally unethical and some maybe interesting and ethical.
Yeah, this thing, like for us, I mean, there's no concern that whatever proprietary changes we've made upon like open source code, that in and of itself presents any particular danger, but these mechanisms will be used. It is an inevitability, and so issues of kind of accreditation or provenance or, you know, what goes into a work and what our role is, that's kind of why we're trying to seed them at this point in time, because invariably it might take 2 years, it might take 20 years, but at the rate of speed of development with this stuff, I think it's going to get really interesting really soon. And so yeah, it's a big question, like who owns what? You can already see now, like many top 10 hits, we've gone from kind of the star making system of a group of writers to someone just purchasing a beat online, right? Like it's quite common now to hear #1 selling singles that someone's just grabbed the music from somewhere else.
Old Town Road.
Well,
Yeah.
for example, and like, more power to that, right? But but so we're kind of in this kind of unusual scenario where the more these tools get used and the more opaque the contributions to that creation are, I think there's room to have 5 or 6 different interpretations of what a good path to navigate that would be.
But also, speaking of accreditation, I should say that those examples are from a really amazing book by Joanna Demers that's about sampling. So that is from her research, and I should say that. There was something else I was going to say. It left my brain.
So maybe I think that we'll take that final question, and if you remember it, you can tack
Okay.
it on.
Yeah. Hello. Thanks for the talk. Just one question. What are the current technical limitations that you encountered in your current system? And what would you like to improve in terms of sound quality, in terms of musical expression, in terms of musical possibilities?
I mean, for me, it's really the real-timeness. I come from working with real-time digital processing of my voice. So it's always been this process of improvising in the studio and then kind of tweaking things in real time. And working with Spawn feels like going back to, like, I don't know, early computer music where you have to, like, you know, have an idea and then wait a week or something to see it realized with punch cards or something. So it's that kind of like impatience that's difficult, but we're working on this real-time system, and that I think that's really promising and could hopefully bring it to the next step.
Yeah, that's it. I'd say latency is the big one. The second part to that is, yeah, fidelity. You know, because actually right now, like, in terms of technical limitations, I mean, working on one GPU, you can actually produce results like quite quickly, but everything is super harsh. There's kind of like a noise floor like that exists on a lot of stuff. It's very early. I mean, the example that we always give, there's an incredible recording by Edward Scott's Leon de Martinville. It's like the first ever recording made on like an old plate. And it's a cheap point. But basically, it's, if you listen to some of the stuff that is output by a neural system at the moment, and you listen to some of those earliest recordings, there's actually kind of a timbral shared timbre experience there. And so upping the fidelity will happen. But right now, I don't see that so much as a technical limitation as actually more just like something of aesthetic interest. And one of the bigger challenges with the record that I actually think was relatively successful was, you know, attempting to modulate all the other production to be able to accommodate the really rough, raspy kind of neural texture of the material that Spawn was creating. So it wasn't so much a limitation, more kind of a challenge.
So
I did remember.
Okay, go.
I wanted to recommend really quickly Peli Greetzer. He writes on the theory of vibe. This is in Glassbead. There's like a kind of a short article, but he wrote his PhD also on this. And it's basically, he studies comparative literature, but he talks about how neural networks can really extract the vibe of an artwork and recreate it, and how that's kind of like fundamentally a new possibility with, you know, again, this kind of Pandora's box situation. So Peli Greetzer.
Resna Garstani, Anil Bava-Kavia, Joanna Demers, Peli Greetzer.
I just want to thank both of you for joining me on this panel. I feel like I've learned so much from the both of you. So one more time, big round of applause for Holly and Matt. All right, I think now's the time where we fuck off.